Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the channel. What if everything you thought you knew about the discovery of America was only part of the story? What if, centuries before Columbus set sail, Norse seafarers had already crossed the Atlantic, landed on North American shores, and even built settlements? That's not just legend. It's a theory backed by growing archaeological evidence and ancient Norse sagas passed down through generations. In this video, we dive into the heart of this mystery, beginning with a question that challenges the foundation of American historical narratives. Did the Vikings explore more of North America than we've been led to believe? We open with powerful visuals, crumbling Norse artifacts scattered across the rugged Newfoundland landscape, the reconstructed Viking settlement at Meadows bathed in fog, cryptic stone carvings that defy conventional explanation, and medieval maps suggesting knowledge of lands across the sea. These clues, while long overshadowed by the Columbus myth, are beginning to reframe our understanding of who reached the New World first, and how far they may have gone. The Viking Age, spanning from the late 8th to the early 11th century, was a time of bold seafaring, fearless exploration, and the forging of new frontiers. These Norsemen, often portrayed merely as raiders, were in truth complex societies of traders, settlers, and master navigators. They built some of the most advanced ships of their time, longboats capable of withstanding the roughest North Atlantic waters, enabling them to journey far beyond the known edges of the European world. Driven by a mix of necessity and ambition, Viking expansion moved outward in waves. From their Scandinavian homelands, they first established colonies in the British Isles and northern France, but soon their sights stretched even farther west. By the late 9th century, Norse settlers had reached Iceland, drawn by its uninhabited lands and rich resources. Just decades later, under the leadership of explorers like Eric the Red, they pushed on to Greenland, braving frigid waters and uncharted coasts to carve out a foothold on the very edge of the Arctic. The tale of Vinland is not just a footnote. In Viking lore, it is one of the most remarkable and controversial chapters in the history of human exploration. In the Icelandic sagas, particularly the Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red, we find compelling narratives that describe Leif Erikson's voyage to a land far beyond the Greenland coast, a land said to be rich with timber, wild grapes, and fertile soil. This land, which the Norse called Vinland, stood in stark contrast to the harsh climates of Greenland and Iceland, and its promise ignited a wave of Norse curiosity and ambition. Leif Erikson's journey likely took place around the year 1000 CE, nearly 500 years before Columbus set sail. His expedition reportedly followed routes known to Norse sailors, guided by oral accounts, and perhaps even previous sightings by other mariners blown off course. After crossing the Davis Strait and navigating along the coast of what is now northeastern Canada, Leif and his crew are believed to have established a temporary settlement, which modern scholars have linked to Meadows, a Norse site in Newfoundland, Canada, confirmed by archaeologists in the 1960s. The implications of this discovery are monumental. It provides undeniable proof that Norse explorers reached the North American continent centuries before other Europeans, but the sagas also hint at even broader exploration. References to Markland and Helluland suggest knowledge of regions that may correspond to Labrador and Baffin Island. These names weren't just fantasy. They reflect real encounters with unfamiliar terrain, native peoples, and new ecosystems. This evidence forces historians to reevaluate the timeline of transatlantic exploration. Rather than beginning in 1492, with Columbus, the story stretches back further into a murky, underexplored past shaped by the fearless voyages of Norse seafarers. Their journeys challenge the conventional Eurocentric narrative and open up questions about early contact, cultural exchange, and the true extent of Viking exploration in the New World. Vinland becomes not just a place, but a symbol, a testament to human curiosity and the enduring drive to explore beyond the horizon. The Saga of the Greenlanders and the Saga of Eric the Red are two of the most intriguing sources for Norse exploration of North America, rich with characters, dramatic events, and tantalizing hints at real voyages across the Atlantic. But these sagas, written down in Iceland in the 13th century, over 2 centuries after the events they describe, raise a fundamental question. Are they reliable historical records or just compelling legends passed down through oral tradition? The bout Saga of the Greenlanders presents a detailed sequence of voyages, beginning with Bjarni Herjolfsson, who is said to have sighted the North American coast after being blown off course while sailing to Greenland. He didn't land, but his story inspired Leif Erikson to take a more deliberate journey. Leif's expedition is portrayed as successful. He discovers Vinland, explores its resources, and returns to Greenland with stories of this fertile land. The saga then follows further expeditions by Leif's brother Thorvald, who is killed by Indigenous people, referred to in the sagas as Skrælings, and their sister Freydis, whose violent and treacherous actions cast a darker shadow on the Norse presence in Vinland. The saga of Eric the Red offers a slightly different version of events. It emphasizes Leif's voyage as more accidental. He discovers Vinland after being blown off course on his way back from Norway. This saga also introduces more mythic elements, such as strange animals and encounters with otherworldly beings, making it harder to separate fact from fiction. Both sagas share overlapping characters and events, but they diverge in tone, chronology, and detail. This has led historians to approach them cautiously. On one hand, the sagas reflect the cultural memory of real events, vividly preserving names, places, and challenges that suggest genuine exploration. On the other hand, they were written long after the fact, likely embellished over generations, and mixed with folklore, nationalism, and Christian influences. Yet, what makes these sagas so compelling is their consistency with archaeological evidence. The 1960 discovery of the Norse settlement at Meadows in Newfoundland corroborated key elements of the stories: that Vikings did reach North America, that they built temporary dwellings, and that they had contact, often hostile, with indigenous peoples. In the end, the Norse sagas occupy a unique and complex space in the historical record, not entirely factual, yet far from mere fantasy. These texts were passed down orally for generations before being written down, and as with all oral traditions, they evolved with each retelling. They likely absorbed elements of local folklore, personal bias, exaggeration, and later religious influences, especially as they were transcribed by Christian scribes in medieval Iceland. This makes them imperfect as literal accounts, but deeply valuable in understanding the mindset and culture of the Norse people. Rather than dismissing the sagas for their inconsistencies or mythical overtones, historians have come to appreciate them as cultural artifacts that blend historical memory with storytelling. They preserve not just names, events, and places, but values, beliefs, and social dynamics. The recurring themes of bravery, exploration, conflict, and honor reflect the Norse worldview, one that celebrated venturing into the unknown, testing fate, and leaving a mark on distant lands. The sagas also give us insight into how the Norse people perceived their role in the world. They didn't see themselves as mere settlers or raiders, but as bold navigators of vast oceans, capable of reaching lands that lay beyond the edge of familiar maps. In this way, the sagas speak to a cultural identity rooted in mobility, adaptability, and resilience, qualities essential for survival in the harsh environments of Scandinavia, the North Atlantic, and beyond. And crucially, the sagas gain credibility from archaeological validation. The ruins at Meadows offer physical proof that Vikings did indeed make it to North America around the year 1000 CE, supporting the idea that these stories, though embellished, contain a core of truth. Together, the sagas and the archaeological evidence paint a picture of a people who may not have colonized the New World permanently, but who ventured further than previously believed, leaving behind not only relics in the soil, but also stories that have echoed for 1,000 years. So while the sagas may not offer a precise roadmap of Viking voyages, they serve as a powerful lens through which to view the ambitions, imagination, and identity of a society that dared to look beyond the horizon. In 1960, the world's perception of early North American exploration changed forever with the discovery of Meadows, a site located on the northern tip of Newfoundland, Canada. This site, remarkably well preserved, offered the first undeniable evidence that the Vikings had indeed reached North America nearly 500 years before Columbus. The discovery was the result of a daring excavation led by Norwegian archaeologist Helge Ingstad and his wife, Anne Stine Ingstad, who had been studying Viking sagas and theories about Norse exploration. They stumbled upon a set of unusual stone structures on a remote headland. At first, the site's significance wasn't immediately clear, but as the excavations progressed, it became apparent that they had uncovered something extraordinary: the remains of a Viking settlement. Carbon dating of the wooden artifacts, along with the architecture and tools found at the site, confirmed that the settlement dated to around 1000 CE, right in the period described by the Norse Sagas. The site revealed several buildings, including a large longhouse, which was a typical structure for Norse settlements in Greenland and Iceland. The discovery of metal tools and artifacts such as a spindle whorl, iron rivets, and a whetstone further supported the conclusion that this was a Norse colony. In addition to these findings, the architectural style of the site mirrored what was described in the sagas, with its characteristic turf walls and simple, functional layout. The fact that the site was located on the northern tip of Newfoundland, far from the known Viking territories in Greenland, was also telling. It was precisely the type of location the sagas suggested, a place where the Norse, seeking to expand and explore, would have arrived after a long voyage across the North Atlantic. Meadows' significance is immense, as it marks the first confirmed European settlement in North America. This evidence disrupts the long-held belief that Columbus was the first European to set foot on the continent in 1492. Instead, the Vikings, led by Leif Erikson and others, had already ventured across the Atlantic, establishing a base from which they may have explored further into North America, perhaps even as far as the Gulf of St. Lawrence or the northeastern U.S., as some evidence suggests. The discovery of Meadows significantly alters the narrative of pre-Columbian exploration in North America. For centuries, the prevailing belief was that the Vikings had merely ventured across the Atlantic for brief raids or explorations, but never attempted to establish permanent settlements. Meadows dispels that notion, offering concrete evidence that the Norse were not just fleeting visitors but settlers with a genuine intention to create a lasting presence. The site, with its well-constructed buildings, tools, and artifacts, reveals that the Vikings engaged in more than just exploratory missions. They built homes, used advanced techniques for woodworking and metalworking, and likely traded with indigenous groups. While the settlement didn't last long, likely due to the challenges of living in a harsh new environment and the possible conflicts with the local indigenous populations, it nonetheless represents the Vikings' serious attempt to colonize and expand into North America. This discovery in Newfoundland offers an important historical perspective, confirming the Viking presence in the New World well before Columbus's arrival. It challenges traditional historical narratives and broadens our understanding of European exploration, suggesting that Norse exploration was a precursor to the age of European colonization that would follow centuries later. The archaeological evidence found at Meadows affirms that the Vikings weren't just mythic figures in the sagas. They were real, determined explorers who left an indelible mark on the history of North America. The discovery at Meadows is not the only clue suggesting Viking exploration across North America. Over the years, there have been several other mysterious finds that hint at the Norse presence beyond Newfoundland. From Maine to Minnesota and the remote islands of Labrador and Baffin Island, these clues continue to add weight to the theory that Viking exploration in North America was far more extensive than previously acknowledged. One of the most intriguing finds is in Maine, where several objects resembling Viking-style architecture and artifacts have been discovered. These structures are built in a way that mirrors the types of longhouses and buildings the Norse constructed in their settlements, suggesting that they may have established other sites along the North American coastline. While there is no conclusive evidence to firmly date these findings to the Viking Age, the similarities between these structures and those at Meadows cannot be ignored. In Minnesota, the famous Kensington runestone was discovered in 1898. This artifact, a large stone inscribed with runic characters, is believed by some to be a Viking relic. While its authenticity has been debated extensively, with some arguing it may be a hoax, others point to its detailed inscriptions, which describe a Viking expedition in the area, perhaps as far inland as Minnesota. If genuine, the Kensington runestone would offer direct evidence that Vikings ventured far beyond coastal regions and explored the interior of the continent, possibly interacting with indigenous tribes in the heart of North America. Further north, in the harsh and remote environments of Labrador and Baffin Island, researchers have uncovered additional Norse-style artifacts. These include stone structures that closely resemble the ones found in Greenland, as well as iron objects and weapons that match Viking craftsmanship. These findings, though sparse, provide more evidence of Norse movement across the northern reaches of the continent, where they would have been well within their maritime range. In addition to the physical evidence, oral traditions from Indigenous peoples also support the idea of Norse exploration. Many tribes in Canada and the northern U.S. have stories of fair-haired visitors arriving from the sea long before the arrival of Columbus. These accounts describe people with features and appearances that match Viking descriptions, such as blonde hair and pale skin. While these oral histories have often been dismissed as myths or folklore, they align with the timeline and geographical locations of known Viking voyages, providing a cultural and historical layer to the growing body of evidence. Taken together, these scattered clues, whether in the form of architectural remains, inscriptions, artifacts, or Indigenous accounts, paint a picture of a widespread Norse exploration of North America. While none of these pieces alone provide irrefutable proof of Viking settlements across the continent, they collectively contribute to the growing argument that the Norse were far more active in the Americas than traditional history has acknowledged. The growing body of evidence pointing to Norse exploration of North America is certainly compelling, but it has also sparked significant controversy and debate among historians, archaeologists, and researchers. While some firmly believe that the Vikings had a far-reaching presence in the Americas, others remain skeptical, questioning the authenticity of the findings and suggesting alternative explanations for the evidence. One of the most debated artifacts in this discussion is the Kensington runestone, discovered in Minnesota in 1898. The stone is inscribed with runic characters, depicting an account of a Viking expedition that allegedly took place in 1362. The text describes a group of Vikings venturing into the region, leaving behind the stone as a marker. The debate over its authenticity has raged for more than a century, with some experts arguing that it is a genuine artifact from the Viking era, while others claim it is a hoax. Supporters of the runestone's authenticity point to the consistency of the runic inscriptions with other Viking-era texts and symbols, and they argue that its age has been confirmed by geological tests. Additionally, the details contained in the stone's inscription, such as references to an encounter with Indigenous people, align with historical accounts of Viking exploration. However, detractors claim that the Kensington runestone was likely a product of 19th-century inventors or a hoax, possibly created by Scandinavian American settlers who wanted to tie themselves to the prestigious Viking heritage. Some also point out that the language used in the inscription seems somewhat anachronistic, with certain characters not aligning with known Viking-era runes. Given these conflicting perspectives, the Kensington runestone remains one of the most divisive and puzzling artifacts in the Viking exploration debate. In addition to the controversies surrounding individual artifacts, some scholars propose an alternative theory to explain Viking involvement in North America: that the Norse were not attempting to establish permanent settlements, but rather engaged in trade or exploration without creating lasting communities. According to this theory, the Vikings could have traveled across the Atlantic to trade goods, establish temporary camps, or make contact with indigenous populations, without necessarily intending to stay long-term or create structured settlements. This theory posits that the Viking presence in North America was more transient than previously thought. The Norse may have used the continent's resources, such as timber, fur, and minerals, and traded them with indigenous peoples. However, due to conflict with native populations, environmental challenges, or a lack of sufficient resources, the Vikings never established the type of permanent settlement seen in their homeland or in Greenland. Instead, they may have carried out brief expeditions and then returned to their strongholds in Greenland and Iceland. While this theory offers a more cautious interpretation of the Norse presence, it's not without its own set of questions. Critics argue that this doesn't fully explain the physical evidence of Viking-style structures, such as those found in Newfoundland or Maine. Additionally, the idea that the Norse would have embarked on such extensive voyages for trade alone, without leaving lasting settlements, is seen by some as implausible. After all, the Viking culture was heavily invested in establishing permanent colonies wherever they went, as evidenced by their settlements in Greenland and Iceland. While this theory offers a more cautious interpretation of the Norse presence, it's not without its own set of questions. Critics argue that this doesn't fully explain the physical evidence of Viking-style structures, such as those found in Newfoundland or Maine. Additionally, the idea that the Norse would have embarked on such extensive voyages for trade alone without leaving lasting settlements is seen by some as implausible. After all, the Viking culture was heavily invested in establishing permanent colonies wherever they went, as evidenced by their settlements in Greenland and Iceland. Both sides of the debate, those who believe the Vikings were permanent settlers in North America and those who view them as transient explorers, have valid arguments, and the controversy continues to shape how we understand Viking exploration. Regardless of the outcome of these debates, one thing is clear. The story of the Vikings in North America is far more complex than previously assumed, and ongoing research and discoveries will likely continue to challenge and expand our understanding of this fascinating chapter in history. One of the most intriguing aspects of the Viking exploration of North America is the potential interactions between the Norse explorers and the indigenous peoples they encountered. Norse sagas are filled with references to skraelings, a term used to describe the native peoples they encountered during their voyages to Vinland. But who exactly were the skraelings? And what impact, if any, did these interactions have on both Viking and indigenous cultures? The word skraeling is believed to have been a term used by the Norse to describe the indigenous peoples they encountered, though it's unclear exactly which groups the term refers to. The Norse sagas mention various encounters with skraelings, some of which were peaceful and others hostile. These interactions were likely with groups such as the Beothuk, Mi'kmaq, and other Algonquin-speaking peoples, who lived in the coastal regions of Newfoundland and Labrador, as well as parts of the northeastern U.S. One of the most famous accounts of a skraeling encounter comes from the Saga of the Greenlanders, which describes a battle between the Vikings and the skraelings. The Vikings, who were armed with swords, shields, and other weapons, were said to have had a difficult time fighting the skraelings, who used bows and arrows. The saga details how the Vikings retreated after a fierce battle, suggesting that the indigenous peoples were capable of mounting serious resistance to the foreign invaders. Another significant reference to skraelings appears in the Saga of Eric the Red, which speaks of a group of Norsemen who were driven off by the skraelings when they attempted to establish a settlement in Vinland. These accounts suggest that the Vikings did not have easy access to the land or its resources, and that indigenous peoples were deeply integrated into the territory the Norse sought to occupy. In terms of cross-cultural interactions, there is little concrete evidence that the Vikings and indigenous peoples shared much beyond the occasional conflict or trade. However, the possibility that the Vikings traded with or learned from the indigenous peoples cannot be dismissed. Some scholars believe that the Vikings may have learned valuable survival techniques, such as how to hunt and fish in the northern environments, and might have exchanged knowledge on navigation or boat building. There are even theories suggesting that the Vikings could have adopted or modified certain tools and technologies from indigenous groups, such as the use of birch bark canoes, which were used extensively by some native groups in the region. In fact, there are numerous instances where artifacts and technologies that resemble those used by Native Americans have been found alongside Viking artifacts. For example, certain stone tools recovered from Viking sites in Newfoundland resemble tools used by the indigenous peoples of the area. While it's impossible to say with certainty that these items were directly exchanged between the two cultures, the overlap in technology does suggest that there was some form of contact. The impact of these encounters, however, is likely to have been more limited than one might assume. The Vikings' time in North America was short-lived, and their settlements were primarily isolated from the larger indigenous communities. Many of the Viking settlements were abandoned relatively quickly, either due to resource shortages, conflict, or the difficulties of maintaining such distant outposts. Given the brief and tumultuous nature of their contact, it's unlikely that the Vikings had a profound or lasting impact on indigenous cultures. Still, the idea that the Norse might have left a trace in native stories or artifacts is fascinating. Some indigenous groups have oral traditions that mention fair-skinned, bearded visitors who arrived from across the sea. While these stories could simply be reflective of later European contact, it's possible they have roots in the Viking presence in North America. These narratives may contain fragments of historical memory passed down through generations, offering an indigenous perspective on the brief but significant interactions that occurred in the 11th century. Moreover, the presence of Norse artifacts in indigenous territories could have influenced how the indigenous peoples perceived the world outside their immediate environments, even if those interactions didn't lead to lasting exchanges. The presence of foreign goods, such as metal tools or weapons, may have sparked curiosity or established trade routes, even if no sustained relationships ever formed. The question of whether the Vikings' brief presence in North America left a lasting impact on indigenous cultures remains an open one. What we do know is that these interactions were part of a broader tapestry of cross-cultural encounters that have shaped North American history long before the arrival of Columbus. While the Vikings' role may have been relatively small, the fact that they were one of the first European groups to make contact with native peoples marks an important chapter in the complex history of early exploration. In recent years, the tools available to historians and archaeologists have drastically expanded, allowing for new investigations into the Viking presence in North America that were previously unimaginable. Technologies such as LIDAR scanning, DNA analysis, and satellite archaeology are now being used to uncover evidence that could rewrite the history of Viking exploration in the New World. These methods are not only confirming the Norse presence in places like Newfoundland, but are also revealing new possibilities for Viking settlements, trade routes, and interactions that may have extended far beyond what we initially thought. One of the most exciting developments is the use of LIDAR scanning, a remote sensing technology that uses laser light to scan the ground and create detailed maps of the landscape, including beneath dense vegetation. This technology has been particularly useful in mapping areas where traditional archaeological methods might struggle. In regions like Newfoundland, LIDAR has provided clearer insights into the Viking site at Meadows, revealing the layout of the settlement and helping archaeologists to better understand the construction of the Norse buildings. But LIDAR is also being used to scan more remote areas that could harbor additional Viking sites, particularly in the northern regions of North America, where early Viking exploration may have extended. DNA studies are another breakthrough tool in modern investigations of Viking exploration. Genetic testing has allowed scientists to track Viking bloodlines and understand the movement of Norse people across Europe and into North America. By studying the DNA of contemporary populations in places like Greenland and parts of Canada, researchers can trace possible Viking ancestry and reveal evidence of historical migrations. In some cases, studies have suggested genetic connections between modern-day populations and those who lived in Viking settlements like Meadows. Additionally, DNA analysis of ancient human remains in Viking-age sites is shedding new light on the interactions between the Norse and indigenous peoples, allowing scientists to better understand the extent of their contact. Satellite archaeology, which uses satellite imagery to identify potential archaeological sites, has also opened up new avenues for exploration. This method has helped archaeologists spot unusual features in the landscape that could indicate human activity, such as possible Viking settlements or trade routes that were once hidden beneath centuries of soil and vegetation. By studying large-scale satellite imagery, researchers have identified features in places like the Canadian Arctic, which suggests that Norse explorers may have ventured even further north than previously believed. These new discoveries are forcing scholars to rethink the boundaries of Viking exploration and the geographic extent of their expeditions. Perhaps most importantly, these modern technologies are providing the first real opportunity to confirm long-standing theories and challenge past assumptions about the Vikings' role in North America. For years, historians have debated the extent of Viking exploration, with many arguing that the Norse presence in the New World was limited to a brief stay at Meadows. However, with new discoveries emerging from these cutting-edge tools, it seems increasingly likely that the Vikings not only reached North America, but may have maintained a longer presence, built additional settlements, or traded with indigenous groups over a much wider area than originally thought. In light of these discoveries, the question on many scholars' minds is whether we are on the brink of rewriting history. Could the Vikings have had a more extensive and lasting presence in North America than previously believed? And if so, what does that mean for our understanding of early European exploration? The new technologies that have opened up this field of research are allowing for a deeper and more nuanced understanding of the Viking story, providing a clearer picture of their interactions with the New World and its people. While we can't yet definitively say whether Viking exploration in North America was as widespread and impactful as some new findings suggest, the evidence is certainly mounting. As technology continues to advance, so too will our understanding of these ancient explorers. Whether these new revelations will lead to a full-scale rewriting of history remains to be seen, but one thing is clear. The story of the Vikings in the New World is far from finished. With every new discovery, we're getting closer to understanding the true scope of Viking exploration and the hidden history that may have been buried for centuries. The story of Viking exploration in North America remained hidden for centuries, not because the evidence wasn't there, but because the prevailing historical narrative didn't allow for it. For centuries, the idea that Columbus was the first European to discover the Americas was solidified in Western culture, both in popular consciousness and academic scholarship. This narrative, built on the legend of Columbus's 1492 voyage, became deeply entrenched in the development of American national identity and European colonialism. The concept of a singular discovery of the New World, led by Columbus, served to reinforce the idea of European superiority and the justified civilizing mission of colonization. Anything that contradicted this narrative, such as the Viking expeditions centuries before, had to be either downplayed or overlooked. One reason Viking exploration was largely ignored or dismissed was the sheer dominance of Columbus's legacy. The age of exploration, driven by the idea of European nations seeking new lands to conquer, was framed by Columbus's voyages. The myth of Columbus as the first European to discover America took on an almost sacred quality, promoted by historical figures, governments, and later textbooks. Even when evidence of Norse exploration surfaced, such as the discovery of Meadows, the historical community was often reluctant to embrace it, as it threatened to undermine the established narrative. Moreover, the Vikings' role in American history didn't neatly fit into the larger myth of European colonial dominance. Unlike Columbus, who arrived in the Caribbean and eventually sparked the large-scale colonization of the Americas, the Vikings never established permanent colonies in North America. Their settlements were small and short-lived, primarily trading outposts rather than the extensive civilization-building projects that followed the Spanish, English, and French colonization efforts. This lack of lasting impact may have further diminished the importance of their voyages in the eyes of historians, who tended to focus on the more dramatic and transformative events in world history. However, as modern historians and archaeologists have begun to re-examine the evidence, a new understanding of Viking exploration is taking shape. The rediscovery of Norse settlements and trade routes suggests a more complex and nuanced history of European exploration in the Americas. The Vikings were not simply raiders. They were among the first to engage in sustained exploration and interaction with the New World. Yet their legacy, unlike Columbus's, did not lead to the rapid expansion of European empires or the mass displacement of indigenous peoples. As such, their history was relegated to the margins, overshadowed by the far-reaching consequences of later European colonization. The influence of Viking exploration on the modern Viking mythos, however, cannot be understated. As historical evidence has been uncovered, Viking exploration has taken on a larger-than-life role in popular culture, fueled by the romanticized image of the fierce, adventurous Norse warrior. From television series like Vikings to films and books, the idea of the Vikings as bold and fearless explorers is woven into the fabric of modern myth-making. However, the historical truth of their exploration is often lost in the glare of this larger-than-life image. The Vikings were not just warriors. They were traders, settlers, and explorers who left their mark in ways that are only now being fully understood. This mythologizing of the Vikings has contributed to a renewed interest in their role in history and even to shifts in how we understand the development of American identity. The Columbus first narrative has come under scrutiny, as more people are coming to recognize that the history of the Americas is far older and more complex than previously thought. The Vikings, whose voyages were isolated and largely unsuccessful, in the long term, are now being seen as part of the larger mosaic of exploration that shaped the world we know today. In many ways, the history of Viking exploration is being rediscovered not just as a footnote to the past, but as a key chapter in the broader story of human migration, interaction, and cultural exchange. By acknowledging this early chapter of European exploration, we are beginning to challenge the oversimplified narrative that Columbus was the singular discoverer of the Americas. Instead, we are recognizing that the story of the Americas is far more intricate, with multiple cultures, peoples, and stories contributing to the complex history of this continent. Ultimately, the Vikings' forgotten history in North America serves as a reminder of how history is often shaped by the stories we choose to tell, and how the past can be forgotten or obscured by dominant narratives. The unearthing of Viking history challenges the Columbus first myth and prompts us to reconsider who we recognize as the true pioneers of the New World. As we wrap up today's exploration, it's clear that the Vikings did indeed reach North America and possibly further than we've traditionally believed. From the discovery of Meadows to mysterious artifacts and oral traditions across the continent, the evidence suggests that the Norse were not just voyaging in search of new lands, but establishing a presence that challenges the established narrative of first discovery. Their story has been overshadowed by later historical events, but new discoveries continue to push the boundaries of what we know about Viking exploration. This history reminds us to think critically about the past. It challenges the accepted narratives and encourages us to dig deeper, ask questions, and consider all the pieces of the puzzle, no matter how long they've been hidden. The Vikings may not have left an empire, but their journeys across the Atlantic laid the foundation for much of the exploration that followed. If you enjoyed this deep dive into forgotten history, make sure to like, comment, and subscribe for more untold stories. I'd love to hear your thoughts. What do you think? Were the Vikings the true first Europeans in North America, or is there even more to the story? And if you have any local legends or theories from your own regions, feel free to share them in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going and continue uncovering the past together.